So, you have been all of you have been talking about responsiveness to change. Step forward here, yes, that's good. Of course, a thing that is very important as of today. Well, you have all been talking a little bit about how you are responsive to change and how you think we all should be responsive to change. If you would talk about a little bit about the major changes you see in the logistics industry affecting the future, what would you be talking about? Claes, if you start. That's a big question with a little bit of a shorter answer.
Well, as everyone has understood, I'm very much macro, so I'm not very much into the logistics industry as such. But I would say that I would stress very much what has been mentioned by many here, that it's the intra-regional trade in different parts of the world that will grow. And that will be the main logistical challenge, because infrastructure is lacking in many Asian countries, particularly the domestic, the inland structure. So short haul traffic compared to the long haul traffic that we have seen. And I will particularly look at China and the drift to the west, and the fact that most of the Chinese provinces today lack sufficient infrastructural level.
The intra-trade, Claes is saying, and shorter distances. Do you agree? Do you have other things that you think will affect the industry the coming years? Dr. Trefzger? You have already been talking about your trends, but...
Right, yeah. Intra-trade is the biggest growth market in intra-trade, not only in Asia, but in other markets. And if you ask for a recipe, I think it's focus. You have to decide what are the future markets. Maersk has decided on 15, others decide on 20, and then you have to focus to get a certain footprint in those markets. And you have to partner up with local companies or local partners, because on your own, in many markets, you will not be able to be successful. That's the same also applies for a big 3PL like Schenker, being active in more than 128 countries, but we have to partner with local companies in certain areas where we have a lack of competence, or where we want to go faster to the market, to the customers, than with our own organic approach.
Hans, these people from the industry talk a lot about change and being responsive to change, as you yourself wanted when you were up here on stage. Do you think they've done their homework enough? Do you think they've done their homework enough?
Well, from my perception, yes, we are doing our homework, so that's not the discussion. What we see in our 3PL study, which I mentioned, is that the growth of, let's say, competitors coming from that part of the world into our world is tremendous. The entrepreneurial spirit which is behind it. As you were saying, to have the perception that we own the world is complacent.
Questions for the panel? What are your questions for the panel today? Yes, please. I don't think we have a microphone, but if you just rise and speak up, I think we can hear you.
You talk a lot about China, which is a big trend. But has been going on for a while. I'm interested in your views about South America. What you see coming. There are things happening. How do you see those regions coming in the next 5 years?
Okay, the question was about Africa and South America, because we've been talking a lot about China and Asia here today. What do you see? Africa, somebody mentioned Africa here today. Africa and South America, yes.
No, I would certainly say that Africa is coming up. It is a focus area for us. I have to say, I think there's a lot of money to be made. I also think it's perhaps a little less competitive today because fewer players are there. So I think it's a real opportunity. But the size of the pie is really small. South America, of course, is coming up and has been for a while. It is mainly focused on Brazil, of course. I think the rest of South America is perhaps, if I can say, a little less interesting from a growth perspective.
It's a little bit less stable, maybe. Jan Erik?
Well, if we start with South America, Volvo has been there since 1932, so that is already a very well-established part of the world for us. And I mean, if we look at Brazil, it has been an extraordinarily good market, and as well as other parts of South America. So we are continuing developing in that region. The new territory is, of course, Sub-Sahara Africa. And I think one needs to stress Sub-Sahara Africa, because the northern part have their own sort of issues. But if you look at the growth in Angola, for example, it is, in terms of percentage-wise, it's huge. And I think for European companies or Scandinavian companies, this opens up, I think, a good possibility to participate. But it's rather urgent that we do so. Otherwise, we will be squeezed by and completely swamped out by Chinese manufacturer. And we can see that already now, being a sort of provider of trucks. And that opens up a completely new challenge for us. That is to provide vehicles that are adapted to the regional conditions, but at the same time continue to have the quality and as well as mitigate the environmental issues as we have in our products in Europe or North America. And that, I think, goes back to this Harman Kardon story, that needs to be done in a completely new way, and that's a big challenge for us.
Would you say that, you were touching upon that already, China is already in sub-Saharan Africa with their vehicle producers, for instance. Would you say that the European or Scandinavian companies is already lagging behind in this?
Well, to some extent. I mean, we have been in, it depends on, sub-Saharan Africa is, of course, you have one part where we have been since a long time, and that's South Africa. So that's, if you distinguish that a little bit, because it's quite different. We have production facilities in South Africa. But the rest, I think, certainly we are lagging behind. But I think there is a possibility to regain market options in sub-Saharan Africa. But it needs to be done rather urgently.
Rather quickly. Claes?
Just to continue with China, that what is interesting is that the African economic growth right now is very much driven from China. It's Chinese outward investment to African countries, but also to Latin America. And these investments are resource-driven right now, but they could, in the future, become more market-driven and competition and technology-driven. That is the case today. And when it comes to Africa, Africa has the most favorable demographic situation. So if we look 30, 40 years ahead, then I would say that the bulk of the economically active population, that is, so to say, in the most productive years, they live in Africa rather than in other parts of the world.
We have the youngest population in the world, Hans.
Yeah, just one remark. I liked your slide about the history with the Chinese dominance and then the upcoming of the West. To add on what you're saying, one of the observations one might have in sub-Saharan Africa is that Chinese investment there have a long-term view, which means that they're not paying in money but in infrastructure, which helps them both ways.
Yeah, well, it certainly does. Yes, Dr. Trefzger.
Yeah, we have a lot of hurdles also when we move to Africa. I mean, we are talking about 52 countries or 53 countries on the African continent, 1 billion inhabitants, rather young. But 50% of the countries are difficult to do business with, especially given our history in colonialization and our mentality of doing business. I mean, I don't know whether there's a Chinese word for compliance, but there is a different way, a different approach, and we have to take this into account when we deal with Africa. So we have not selected all African countries as target countries. I would agree with Sub-Sahara, and some other countries, but the rest, it's very difficult from our perspective to do business in, and maybe it's better to stay out for the next couple of years as well.
Yeah, it's a big cultural challenge, Jan-Erik.
Well, definitely, and I think this was very wise. I mean, even so, I think Sub-Saharan Africa is important. Sub-Saharan Africa is not homogeneous; it's very heterogeneous. Yeah. So one obviously need to perhaps focus on certain countries where the possibilities are easier. And let me give you one example. I mean, the fact that Chinese now is putting a lot of efforts in infrastructure. They basically give away trucks. That comes basically for free when they want to explore and exploit the natural resources in Africa. But what they don't do is provide good service networks, dealer networks, and for the customers really to sort of have a long-term possibility to use these vehicles. And I think to do that in a way that we are used to have possibilities.
So
and that is maybe what we, if I may add,
yes, of course.
and maybe that is our niche. We will be able to have a bimodal educational system that we can establish in Africa. We can train people. We have a different approach, and we shouldn't try to copy the Chinese investors.
No.
So yes, lots of possibilities in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, but also lots of challenges to sum up. More questions? Yes, please.
I have a question. How do you say the development in Northern Africa, starting from Morocco in the west, going over to Egypt and Israel? It's a lot of cable living, trading, more than 300 million, big lot of dictators like Libya, Egypt, etc., etc. And it's not been mentioned so much, but it's very close to Europe.
So the question was about Northern Africa, where we can see a lot of democratization processes now. So how does that affect Europe? It's close to Europe, this man says. Yes, Jan-Erik.
I mean, we are already there, and the reason is that in 2001 we acquired Renault Trucks, and the history between France and the Northern Africa is very, very strong. So in parts of Northern Africa, with the brand Renault Trucks, we are present, and that's why I said the opportunities and the sort of white spot on our map is sub-Saharan Africa. But obviously, taking into account the Arab Spring, it has been quite turbulent over the last year and a half or 2 years. Well, it's always been turbulent in some parts of some of these countries. But obviously, the opportunities are there as well. But for our company, we have a strong establishment already.
Yes,
well, if I can just add there, if you look at the shipping world and the Mediterranean and the investments for the past 10 years in the Mediterranean on infrastructure, which is primarily big ports, all the big investments are placed in North Africa now. What is being built in Europe, or is just enhancing what is already there. But the terminals that are coming up are happening in Egypt, in Morocco, which at least for a period was seen as some of the more stable. And I think that's where the investments will go also in the future, because it's easier particularly from a labor perspective. You need infrastructure in transportation to work 24/7. That's very hard to come by. I lived in Greece and Italy. It's very hard to come by in those countries, and that's why this is moving south.
Yes, Dr. Trefzger.
Yeah, and we are active there as well for many decades, Northern Africa, Eastern Africa, and Sub-Saharan. And again, we celebrate 50 years anniversary in South Africa this year. And Northern Africa is part of our European groupage network. You don't have a daily truck to those markets, but you have trucks going into those markets. It has changed after the Arab Spring, but it will bounce back and will come back. And has been a major production site, or has established some of the countries as a major production site for automotive Tier 1 and Tier 2. So these markets are coming, and they are getting closer to Europe, especially via the French relationships there.
Finn, yeah. How do you reason when it comes to Africa?
Daxa has also been in the northern part of Africa, in Morocco, for the last 15 years. And we actually do have daily transport to Morocco. So
we can join,
use your trucks. So it is an important market
you can take on board your colleagues here.
Yeah.
Okay, more questions? Yes.
Can I add one more thing? When you are in regions like that, it's extremely important that you have a great flexibility, because political things change, and suddenly you lose the market, and there sanctions come into force. So that is a specific challenge in these type of markets.
Klaus, you wanted to add something?
I would be a little more pessimist about North Africa. There are very few signs right now about openness and liberalization, and there are many signs in the other direction. particularly when it comes to Egypt. So we should never overlook the trends of anti-West, anti-modernization, and pro-fundamentalism that we can see today. So I would say, from a macroeconomic point of view, it's incredibly difficult to predict right now.
So there are a couple of warning signs. What do you say as a professor? Now you're talking about democratization process, which is very good for humans, but we also do trade with dictators, and yes, sometimes I heard one politician say that it could be more stable to do trade with dictatorship countries. What do you say about this? Should we actually do trade with countries that are not democratic?
Well, from an economist's perspective,
yes.
I would say that we believe that openness and liberalization that will promote also a long-term shift in democratic direction. That is my guts feeling.
But it's a big gray zone there.
But at the same time, I would say that it was a high level of stability in the world pre-Arab Spring in that sense. But a young, I would say, impatient population will probably not accept a rush back to a fundamentalist stance in North African politics. So that makes me a little more optimistic anyway.
We'll see where this ends. Yes, please.
Yes, you said it yourself. I would like to, you have all talked about China in rather positive terms. And it's, of course, a huge market, but they provide also huge competition. Today it was an article in the service industry about the steel market, how they are dumping the prices of steel with the help of lack of decent treatment of workers, for example, and things like that. And don't forget, China is not a democratic country, and it's so. And how do you see on the risks of this trend, the Chinese trend?
Yes, so the question is, how do you actually perceive the risks which is attached to China as well? It's not a democratic country, as he says, and it's also, they are also growing competitors. They're using different methods, so to say, in doing business. How do you look upon these issues? Dr. Trefzger.
Yeah, you cannot hinder them of doing, of being very aggressive competitors. We have to define our own way. From a 3PL perspective, we have to be active in each and every country, and we have to deal with the political and business risk environment that we find in the local market, because there are consumers living there. And therefore, we have to cope with whatever we find locally. And we have to adapt and find our own ways. I think we still think in the let's build some walls scenarios when we talk about China and other markets. We will not hinder them to become successful and to grow and to overwhelm the world with their products. It might be hindered by infrastructure, by labor cost increases. We made a study a couple of years ago, and the only factor, even if you take an oil price of $300 per barrel or CO2 certificates with 100 euros per barrel, it doesn't change the world pattern. Only labor cost and productivity changes the world pattern. And by the way, we are driving this trend. We buy and tend to buy cheap products. We want a cheap flat screen. We want a flat screen for 600 euros. We are driving it. Nobody else. The consumers in the Western countries.
Money talks. Yes, Hans, Jan-Erik, and then Christian. Yes.
Okay. The university that I'm connected to, Nijrode, did some research on what are the most successful multinationals from the Netherlands in China. And they include companies such as Philips and Unilever. And it was clear that the point you are making, which is transparency and democratic principles, is a big hindrance in doing business there. On the other hand, the entrepreneurial spirit in combination with a plan also pays off, and I'd like to just share one example of that. The company I work for was invited to create an innovation center in Kunshan, which is near Shanghai. And the whole building, which is about six times the size of this, including the internet connections and all that, was given for free for the coming 6 years. The only thing they want is to share into our ecosystem of knowledge partners and to share the knowledge. When you go to I went to the Shanghai World Exhibition, and when you see the tremendous impressiveness and the power with which they are developing, my biggest concern, apart from the democratic level, which is absolutely top priority, is also the move from copying, bypassing, I won't use another word, what has been developed in the West, towards designed in China. And that is currently going on very strongly, as we have seen it in Korea. And so one of the major challenges in my innovation job that I see with customers is how do I keep a balance with sharing intellectual property versus being sure what not to share in terms of open innovation. And the best example of that was I hosted 2 workshops in innovation for General Motors. One was General Motors Global in Shanghai, and the next one was Shanghai General Motors. One would think that is one company. It's not, because of this reason. They have a clear definition of what are we going to sell and share in the Chinese market and whatnot. I think that's a tremendously important part of the discussion.
Jan-Erik.
Of course, there are a lot of risks being in China, and you have, of course, the discussion on what is a democracy to start with, and I think there are very few countries in the world that declare themselves non-democracies. I think you can have them on one hand. So that's a battle that we continuously work with to ensure that we behave according to our code of conduct and our principles. But there are also other risks. IPR risk we have experienced the hard way, so to speak. I think that is slightly changing, though, because if you look at the huge investments in R&D and in university and innovation in China, that we will have much more technology coming out of China and not being stolen from other parts of the world. In sort of these quasi-democracy countries, of course, you have risks that legislation change, and they change very, very fast. When we are in Europe and in US, we know, and there are agreements between the legislators and the industry and how to behave in that case. And there are lead times. But in China, you could have things coming extremely, extremely fast. There is a CO2 regulation for trucks that we got to know 2 weeks before it was going to be implemented. And that's, and we had no clue. We had no clue. And I think very few of our competitors had a clue about that. So that's, of course, a risk that you could basically lose your market because legislation is going extremely rapid.
So there you get use of your responsiveness to change that we have been talking about. Christian, you were mentioning Myanmar in Burma, talking about non-democratic countries.
Yes, well, it is still military effectively in control, and obviously they're having a year now to see how things develop, which we hope will turn into a positive direction, which will also help, I think, the development, because that will actually, today, there's illegal foresting going on. We know that crosses the border. Many other things are going on in Myanmar, so they're active in the market, but with a more open economy, we believe that some of that will be legitimized, at least put into some sort of system over the years. I think we have touched very little on the political aspects, because most of us are in business, and we actually live by the regulations that are set up. But I think in relation to China, it's interesting to see that populations and governments back off, and I think a very good example was Rio Tinto in Australia a couple of years back, which was about to be taken over by a Chinese company, and the Australian government stepped in and said no, because this is controlling some of the world's largest resources. A similar discussion is actually ongoing on a much smaller scale now, but it's closer to home. It's Greenland, part of Denmark, but a sovereign state as such per now, but they have, in certain cases, 35 to 40% estimated of some of the world's known rare minerals. The Chinese wants to get there, and Greenland wants, of course, somebody to invest there. If the Chinese are willing, they want, but they don't want to do it on Chinese
So how are you handling this delicate issue in Denmark?
Well, that is actually, unfortunately, it's Greenland themselves that are doing it, but obviously they're trying to pull some help from Denmark in terms of labor regulations, etc., and also trying to probably balance it a little bit and get some Canadian, Australian companies that has the expertise that the Chinese also have to come in to perhaps balance it and develop what they think is responsible mining in a better way in a very sensitive environment.
Delicate issues. Claes, you wanted to add something as well?
Myanmar, 60 million inhabitants. It's the whitest spot in Asia. If I had been in the tourist industry, I would bet on Myanmar, I must say. But may I go back to China? I can't resist to continue talking about that. And this interesting question about totalitarian state. From an economic planning point of view, China is an ideal case because the government can decide the rate of growth more or less because you can control a couple of parameters in the economic system. I'm looking at the previous 5 years plans and the present ones. There is a very systematic trend that you almost every time underrate the actual rate of economic growth because you can always exceed it. This is something that we can prove very well. And there is an overrepresentation of 8s because 8 is a lucky figure in China, so 8.8% growth. That is, so to say, the ideal economic growth. But having said that, I would say that what is right now the most tricky issue is very much the generational shift. 6 months ago, I would say that there will be a very stable generational shift to the new group of leaders that will be elected this autumn. But now we can also see that there is much more a complex situation that we have, and there are counter forces in Chinese politics. So the nightmare scenario would be China returning to a more inward-looking, more totalitarian, and more xenophobic, more so to say, anti-foreign feelings that also could be seen in China. So the generational shift right now is something that should be looked at very, very carefully, and what happens.
That's also a couple of warning signs there. 8.8% of growth for the state to decide. That's to dream of for our finance minister, Anders Borg. More questions for the panel. While you think about this, yes, please, in the back.
Totally changing the subject. Sulfur emission control area. Do you foresee any change in the logistic setup for the Nordic countries? And second part of the question, to be provocative, was the decision to go with the sulfur emission control area, was that being responsible for the planet, or is it naive towards the rest of the world?
I'm not sure I heard the question.
Sulfur emission reduction.
We really need microphones here.
Sulfur emission control area, the new rules from 2015 in the Baltic and in the North Sea. Do you see any change in the logistic setup for Volvo, for example, or from the perspective of Trefzger and Trefzger? And the second part of the question was the decision to commit to the sulfur emission control area. Was that being responsible for the planet, or did naive?
Okay, yes, Christian.
Well, I have a few views on it in as much as we supported our official policy is that there needs to be an international regulation. Going alone in Europe is very difficult. For us, I would say it has a slightly lesser impact because we generally deal with very short time in Europe, so we can deal with that, and the majority is outside for now. But we firmly believe that the only way, at least in our industry, is IMO to make control, and going it alone in Europe for us is a bit naive, I would say.
What do you say, Phil?
I must say I couldn't hear what the question which came. Sorry.
Could you repeat the question?
I think we're talking about the sulfur. You have, I mean, in terms of fuel, if I got the correct and the regulations that EU is now committing to, where parts of the rest of the world, they really don't care. Let's put it that way.
Yes, it's about the EU regulations.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's not only about the EU regulation, it's about the lowering the sulfur limit
the content.
in 2015 in the Baltic Sea area.
Yeah, the content.
But it's also about lowering the global sulfur limit in 2020 or 2025 from 3.5% to something like that to 1%.
But I think that I thought my answer at least addressed that. We believe that has to come together, from our perspective at least.
Yes, Jan-Erik.
Yeah, since we do a lot of shipping out from Gothenburg to various parts in the world by just ships, obviously we have followed and are engaged in this. And I agree completely that it needs to be lowered. It needs to be lowered. But on the other hand, and there are many ways of doing that, but you need to secure that you have a level playing field on the globe. And I think that is crucially important. And then the question, how to do that. And there are people now that argues that if we sort of take this step, obviously the world will follow. I'm not so sure about that. But if that would happen, then this is fine, I think.
So you don't think it's naive? You think it's...
No, I don't think it's naive from sort of the point of view that you need to get rid of sulfur from your fuels. I mean, if you look at diesel, for example, that has been done since a long, long time. And, but it's not easy. It doesn't go fast because of the fact that you need to rebuild a lot of features. Not only the engines, but also the producers of the fuel need to secure that they have production facilities that can handle this. So it's definitely not naive. But, I mean, the question is, will it help by going that much sort of ahead of the rest of the world in this region? And I have no answer on that.
I can take a specific example where we went ahead of the industry, and that was New Zealand, which of course is very committed, at least on paper, to environment and lowering this, and we did it as the only ocean carrier, and it cost us millions of dollars per year. I have to say nobody followed, and none of our customers, unfortunately, were interested in paying any sort of premium for this. So this was we were, you can say, in terms of our offering, we were pretty much on a level playing field. Nobody really put it into, you can say, a tender process that this had an importance to them.
So what happened? Did you drop it, or?
That is under consideration, I would say, because we are under pressure, of course, cost-wise, and we've done it 10 places in the world so far. And if you add that up, and if you only do it yourself, you lose your competitive edge.
What's the reason, do you think, that the competitors didn't follow you, the customers didn't want to pay?
I think that it's the timing right now. Unfortunately, environment has taken a bit of a back burner. Before I came to Sweden, I worked in Greece. It was never on the agenda, I can say, ever. When you talk to any of the
their agenda.
They have other topics.
They have 180 members of the CSR Greece community, so it's not a lot of Greek companies. Okay. So I just think right now it's a hard time to implement this. I should say, though, it has happened in Gothenburg, and it is happening in Gothenburg from a local perspective.
Okay, do we have... Yes, the last question.
Just have a question. We have been talking a lot about China, Brazil, etc. What about Russia? My question would be, like, do you think Sweden and Finland would still play crucial to ship customer from Sweden to Russia? Or you see some tendency that you move your activities to, let's say, Poland, for instance, where you have this new container terminal, I think that's where you can easily serve Russian customers from there.
So the question is about Russia. We haven't been talking about Russia at all. What do you say?
I mean, Russia is important and has been important. For us, Russia becomes a new market with regards to a land bridge that we have established. We have 5 daily trains from Germany to China, container trains, homeopathic volumes compared to ship volumes, but daily trains, and we have a local market there. So you ship from Germany or from Central Europe via Poland into the Russian market, you consolidate there again, and then you continue 18 days or 16 days out east, so to say, into Nanjing or Shenyang with daily volume. So it's an important market locally, but it's also a very important, and becomes a more and more important transit market. But the same applies here as with all the other markets. It's a changing economy. It's an economy with erratic decisions on taxes and certain terms and conditions. As you know, there was a ban on automotive imports 2 or 3 years ago, or a higher tax which led to CKD increases rapidly. And therefore the market is as unpredictable as other markets, but it's a massive market. And on the other side, we get a lot of raw materials back, and some of them are becoming more and more manufactured, lubricants, for example. So the market is changing, and the export pattern is changing as well.
Okay, gentlemen, it's time for us to conclude. I would just like to leave you with a very, very quick and short answer to the question. If you would just give one advice to these people to meet this unplannable future that you have been talking about. One short piece of advice. Claes, if you start, what would that be?
Asia and more Asia.
Asia and more Asia is your advice. Yeah.
Well, I could repeat Asia and more Asia, but I will add something more, and that is that if you are going to meet the sort of unplannable, secure that your R&D and innovation activities are at the forefront, because then you have possibilities to meet the unplannable.
R&D. Hans?
Yes, I'd like to rather take another perspective based on what you were saying here locally in Sweden. So I don't know the local situation, but you made a point about local government organizations and that there's not a central plan. Coming from the Netherlands and having in our country the biggest European port, which is Rotterdam, the same democracy that we value all didn't help us, because it took us 15 years to decide to have a train moving with DB Schenker from the Rotterdam harbor towards the German border. Now we have it, it's our savior. So maybe a piece of advice to the Swedish colleagues would be this is a strategic aspect of the future that cannot be dealt with on a local for local basis. Even in my country, the biggest ports, which is Amsterdam and Rotterdam, work together as one because of this globalization.
We'll take that with us for the afternoon, where we'll meet not the infrastructure minister, but her closest man.
Well, that would be my
Christian, yes.
my thought as well, is on the infrastructure. When these days there's a lot of things happening in Gothenburg, both this conference and other conferences, also related to the maritime industry.